Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just 4 friends, a map, and the promise of an unspoiled stretch of wilderness. The plan was simple: hike during the day, set up camp at night, and tell ghost stories around the fire. But by the second day, the ghost stories became all too real. The trouble started when they lost the trail. "The map says we're here," Carlos said, jabbing a finger at a spot in the forest. "Then where's the creek?" asked Mark, wiping sweat from his brow. "We should have hit it an hour ago." "Maybe the map's old," suggested Heather, her voice trembling just enough to show her unease. "Maps don't change. Creeks don't disappear," muttered Jake, already shouldering his pack. "Let's just keep moving. We'll figure it out." Hours passed, and the sun dipped low. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, and the towering pines began to feel more like prison bars than nature's beauty. When they stumbled upon a cabin, it felt like a small miracle. It was old, that much was clear. The wood was gray and warped, the roof sagged under the weight of moss, and the windows, what little glass remained, were smeared with grime. But it had a door for walls and a chimney that promised warmth. Against the growing chill of night, it was an oasis. "You think anyone lives here?" Heather asked, peering up at the cabin. "Does it look like anyone's lived here in the last 100 years?" Jake replied, stepping onto the creaking porch. "Let's just stay the night," Carla said, her voice betraying her exhaustion. "We'll head out first thing in the morning." Inside, the air was musty, but not unbearable. The main room had a fireplace, a rickety table with mismatched chairs, and a threadbare rug that might have once been red. A staircase led to a loft, its banister leaning like it had given up long ago. For something abandoned, it was oddly intact. They set up their sleeping bags on the floor, ate a quiet dinner of trail mix and energy bars, and lit the fireplace. For the first time all day, they began to relax. Then the first chair moved. "Did you see that?" Heather whispered, her eyes fixed on the table. One of the chairs had shifted, just an inch, but enough to make her stomach churn. "Probably just the floor settling," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. But as the hours dragged on, the furniture didn't just settle. The table shifted closer to the fireplace. The rug curled at the edges. A chair, the same one, slid back into its place at the table as if it had never been moved. Each time they looked away, something else was different. "Let's just leave," Heather said, her voice tight with panic. "We can hike by moonlight if we have to, and get lost again." Mark countered, "No way. We're better off waiting for daylight." It wasn't until they looked at the windows that the true horror began. At first glance, the glass reflected their tired faces and the flickering firelight. But as they watched, the reflections changed. A man stood behind Carla, a man who wasn't there when they turned around. Heather's reflection smiled, though her real face was frozen in terror. And Jake's reflection was missing entirely. "What the hell is going on?" Mark shouted, backing away from the windows. The cabin seemed to answer. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The walls groaned, as if the entire structure were breathing. And then came the voices, low at first, like whispers carried on the wind. But they grew louder, overlapping and impossible to understand. They came from the fireplace, the floorboards, the very air around them. "We need to get out of here," Carla said, her voice breaking. She ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It stuck," she cried, pulling harder. "Let me try," Jake said, shoving her aside. But he couldn't open it either. None of them could. The door didn't even rattle in its frame, as if it had fused with the cabin itself. "The windows," Mark said, "we'll break them," but when they tried, the glass wouldn't shatter. Not with their fists, their boots, or even the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The cabin had them trapped. The whispers turned into moans. The moans turned into screams. And the fire in the hearth burned blue. "What does it want?" Heather sobbed, clutching Carla like a lifeline. "It's hungry," Jake said, his voice hollow. He was staring at the fireplace, where the flames seemed to twist into shapes. Hands, faces, teeth. "Don't be ridiculous," Mark snapped, though his voice wavered. "It's a cabin, not a monster." But even as he said it, the walls seemed to pulse. The floorboards rippled like waves, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. One by one, they started to vanish. It happened without warning. First Carla, yanked into the shadows while the others screamed her name. Then Mark, swallowed by the floor as he clawed at the rug. Heather disappeared last, her terrified face reflected in the windows even after she was gone. Jake was alone. The whispers were deafening now, the walls vibrating with their intensity. He backed into a corner, clutching the iron poker like a weapon. But he knew it was useless. "What do you want from me?" he shouted. The cabin seemed to laugh. The fire roared higher, the blue flames licking the ceiling. And then everything went black. When the search party found the cabin a week later, it was empty. No signs of Jake, Carla, Mark, or Heather. Just a rickety table, mismatched chairs, and a rug that might have once been red. The only clue was a single message scratched into the wood above the fireplace. "It feeds." Story 2. The forest surrounding Ash Creek had a reputation for being strange. Locals warned against camping too close to the water, claiming the creek was haunted. But to David, Claire, Miguel, and Jenna, it was the perfect getaway from their stressful lives. The whispering townsfolk, with their old wives' tales and superstitions, were just part of the charm. None of them believed in ghost stories. The four friends arrived late in the afternoon, setting up camp in the clearing just a stone's throw away from the creek. The water glistened in the fading sunlight, a winding ribbon of glass cutting through the forest. The air was cool, but when Miguel dipped his hand into the creek, he frowned. "That's weird," he muttered. "The water's warm. Like bathwater warm." David shrugged. "Maybe there's a hot spring nearby." Jenna rolled her eyes. "Or maybe it's just nature being nature. Let's get the fire started. I'm starving." They spent the evening laughing, roasting marshmallows, and swapping stories. The kind of camaraderie that only came with the crackle of firewood and the scent of pine in the air. But as the night deepened, A strange unease settled over the group. It was subtle at first, a rustling in the bushes, the distant hoot of an owl that sounded almost like a human moan. "You guys hear that?" Claire asked, glancing over her shoulder. David waved it off. "Relax. It's just the woods. They're always noisy at night." Miguel stood up, stretching. "I'm going to check out the creek. It's been bugging me all night. I swear I saw something moving in the water earlier." "Don't be stupid," Jenna said. "It's pitch black out there." "I've got my flashlight," Miguel replied, grabbing it from his backpack. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. Claire hesitated, but Miguel's confident grin reassured her. "Be careful," she said. Miguel disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bobbing with his steps. The remaining three huddled closer to the fire, the night feeling colder in his absence. Time stretched, and the sound of the creek's gentle babble filled the silence. 20 minutes passed. "He's taking too long," Claire said, her voice tight with worry. "He's probably just exploring," David said, though he didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, they heard Miguel's voice calling out. It was faint, coming from the direction of the creek. "Guys, come here." They grabbed their flashlights and hurried toward the sound. When they reached the creek, Miguel was standing knee-deep in the water, his back to them. His flashlight lay abandoned on the bank, its beam pointing at the trees. "Miguel?" Claire called. He turned slowly, and the sight of him made their blood run cold. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. His lips trembled as he whispered, "There are faces." Under the water, watching me, Jenna stepped forward. "What are you talking about?" "Miguel, come out of there." But he didn't move. Instead, he pointed to the surface of the creek. "Look." Reluctantly, they shone their flashlights onto the water. For a moment, there was nothing but ripples. Then, they saw them. Faint, distorted faces staring up from beneath the surface. Men, women, children, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. Claire screamed, and David grabbed Miguel's arm, yanking him out of the water. The faces vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the creek's surface smooth and unbroken. Back at the campsite, Miguel sat by the fire, shivering despite the warmth. He refused to speak, only muttering the same phrase over and over. "They're still watching." By morning, Miguel was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots still by the tent. The others searched the forest, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. But there was no trace of him, not even footprints. As the sun climbed higher, they returned to the campsite, their hearts heavy with dread. That was when they heard it. Faint whispers coming from the woods. The voices were soft but unmistakable, calling their names one by one. "Claire, Jenna, David." The three friends froze, their blood turning to ice. The whispers came from all directions, circling them like predators. The trees seemed to close in, their branches casting twisted shadows on the ground. "We need to leave," David said, his voice shaking. "Now." They packed up their gear in frantic silence, the whispers growing louder with each passing second. As they made their way back to the trailhead, the air grew heavier, the forest darker. It felt as though something was watching them, following them, When they finally reached their car, they didn't look back. David floored the gas pedal, and the campsite disappeared behind them. But even as they drove away, the whispers lingered, faint and insistent, as if carried by the wind. A week later, the local news reported another group of campers missing near Ash Creek. David, Claire, and Jenna didn't speak of what they had seen. They avoided each other, unable to face the memories that haunted them. But at night, when the world was quiet and the darkness pressed in, they all heard the same thing. Faint whispers calling their names from the shadows. Story 3. The fire crackled and popped, sending embers swirling up into the black void of the sky. A half moon hung low, its pale light barely penetrating the canopy of the dense forest. 6 friends, all in their mid-20s, huddled around the roaring campfire. Laughter filled the air as they passed around a dented flask of whiskey, trying to stave off the night's creeping chill. It was a last-minute trip, one meant to reconnect a group that had started drifting apart since college. Olivia, the planner, had organized everything, picked the site, mapped the trails, even packed enough food for a week. Jake, her boyfriend, had carried the heavy tent. The rest, Hannah, Liam, Derek, and Becca, had tagged along reluctantly, each absorbed in their own worlds of jobs, relationships, and the dull drag of adulthood. The woods were quiet, save for the hum of crickets and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every rustling leaf and snapping twig. It started innocuously enough. Liam, the self-appointed storyteller, had just finished recounting a particularly gruesome ghost story when Becca froze, mid-sip of her whiskey. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The group turned as one, following her gaze to the edge of the firelight. There, just beyond the circle of warmth, sat a figure. The light barely reached them, casting their features in deep shadow. They sat cross-legged, unnervingly still, their head tilted as though listening intently. "Who the hell is that?" Jake demanded, standing up. "Did someone else come camping here?" Olivia asked, glancing nervously at the others. "No one's out here," Derek replied. "We're miles from the nearest road." "Hey," Jake called, stepping toward the figure. "You lost or something?" The figure didn't respond. Jake grabbed a burning stick from the fire and held it up like a torch. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the trees. But as he moved closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, fading like smoke. "What the?" Jake stumbled back, dropping the stick. "He's gone," Liam said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "No way," Derek countered. "He was sitting right there." Olivia's hands trembled as she adjusted her headlamp. Maybe it was a shadow, or an animal. "Animals don't sit like that," Becca said, her voice shaking. No one slept well that night. The next morning, the campsite felt wrong. The air was heavy, and an eerie stillness replaced the usual symphony of birds and insects. Olivia was the first to notice. Their supplies, food, water, even their extra clothes, had been scattered across the clearing. Bags were slashed open, their contents spilling out like entrails. "Who would do this?" she asked, her voice rising. "Maybe a bear," Jake suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Bears don't carve messages into trees, Hannah said, pointing to the trunk of a massive oak. The words were jagged and crude, as though scraped with a knife. I was never alone. The group stared in silence. It's probably some sick prank, Derek said, though his pale face betrayed his calm tone. By who? Liam shot back. We didn't see anyone else when we hiked in. Maybe we should leave, Becca said. No way, Jake replied. We came here to have fun, and I'm not letting some weirdo ruin it. But the mood had shifted. Even Jake, with his bravado, seemed reluctant to stray far from camp. That night, the fire burned low, and the group huddled closer than before. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent their hearts racing. Hannah was the first to notice the shadow. There, she whispered, pointing to the darkness. The figure was back, sitting just outside the fire's glow. This time, they were closer. Enough of this, Jake shouted, grabbing a flashlight. But when the beam landed on the spot, it illuminated nothing but empty ground. They're toying with us, Liam said, his voice barely audible. The figure appeared again, this time behind Derek. Olivia screamed, and Derek spun around, but again, there was nothing there. Panic set in. The group decided to keep watching shifts. Jake and Liam took the first turn while the others tried to sleep. But when Olivia woke in the early hours, she found both men slumped by the fire, fast asleep. Wake up, she hissed, shaking them. What happened? Jake asked groggily. Olivia pointed to the trees. More words had been carved overnight, spreading across multiple trunks like a spreading disease. I see you. I was here. You won't leave. By dawn, the group was packed and ready to leave. No one cared about the supplies they left behind or the trail markers Olivia had meticulously planned. They just wanted to get out. The forest seemed to close in around them as they walked, the trees leaning closer, the underbrush clawing at their legs. Then they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the path ahead. This time, it didn't fade away. It didn't move. Jake stepped forward, his fist clenched. What do you want? He demanded. The figure tilted its head, then raised a hand. When Jake got closer, he froze. The figure wasn't a person at all. It was a scarecrow, a grotesque thing made of sticks and old clothes, with a sack for a head. Pinned to its chest was a note. Leave, while you still can. The group didn't stop running until they reached their cars. Later, when they told the story, some of their friends laughed it off. Others said it was a prank or an overactive imagination. But Olivia couldn't shake the feeling they'd been watched the whole time. And late at night, when she closed her eyes, she could still see the words carved into the trees. I was never alone. Story 4. There were 5 of them. Emma, Nate, Rachel, Tyler, and Ben. Lifelong friends who had decided to escape the grind of city life for a weekend of camping in the remote wilderness of Pine Hollow. The forest was vast and untouched, its towering pines standing like silent sentinels against the backdrop of an indigo sky. The first night was perfect. They built a roaring campfire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped stories under a blanket of stars. But as the fire dwindled to embers and the chill of the night set in, they first heard it. A song. It was faint, like a lullaby whispered from a distance. At first, they thought it was the wind teasing the pine needles, but no wind blew that night. The sound was sweet but haunting, a tune that seemed to float just beyond their understanding. "What's that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. She pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders, her eyes scanning the dark trees. "Probably some bird," Nate said, though his tone betrayed his unease. "Birds don't sing at night," Emma replied, her brow furrowed. Ben, always the skeptic, laughed. "You guys are overthinking it. It's nothing, just the forest playing tricks on your city ears." But none of them slept well that night. By the second day, the unease lingered. They hiked, fished, and laughed, but the tension was palpable, like an invisible weight pressing down on them. Tyler, who had always been the quiet one, seemed particularly distracted. That evening, the lullaby returned, louder this time. The melody was clearer, each note like a hook burrowing into their minds. It was beautiful in a way that made their skin crawl. "Okay, what the hell is that?" Emma demanded, standing up from the fire. "Maybe it's another camper," Nate offered weakly, though they all knew they were miles from the nearest trail. Tyler stood suddenly, his eyes glassy. "I'm gonna check it out." "What?" "No." Rachel grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. "I just need to see," he muttered, as if in a trance. Before anyone could stop him, he disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the forest. They called his name, their voices echoing through the trees, but he didn't answer. The group decided to search for Tyler despite their growing fear. Flashlights in hand, they ventured into the woods, following the faint strains of the song. It seemed to lead them, growing louder with every step. What if it's some kind of, ritual or something? Rachel whispered, clutching Emma's arm. "Don't be ridiculous," Ben snapped, though his flashlight shook in his hand. As they pushed deeper, the forest grew stranger. The air felt thicker, the trees closer together. It was as if the forest itself were alive, watching them. The song was all around them now, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Then they saw it, a circle of pine cones, perfectly arranged on the forest floor. The ground within was bare, as if the earth had been swept clean. Standing in the center was Tyler. He was motionless, his arms hanging limply at his sides. His face was streaked with tears, his eyes wide and vacant. "Tyler," Emma called, running toward him, but as soon as her foot crossed the circle, the singing stopped. The silence was deafening. "Tyler, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked, shaking him. He didn't respond. He didn't blink. Nate stepped forward, his voice shaking. "Guys, I don't think we should." Before he could finish, Tyler spoke. His voice was soft, mechanical, like he was reciting something he didn't understand. "They know you're here. You shouldn't have come." The group froze. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tyler's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, until he was staring directly at her. His lips didn't move, but they all heard his voice. "You're marked now." The words seemed to echo inside their skulls, vibrating through their bones. The flashlight in Ben's hand flickered and died. One by one, the others' lights followed. Panic set in as the forest plunged into darkness. They grabbed Tyler and tried to drag him back to camp, but he wouldn't budge. His body was stiff, rooted to the ground. "Leave him!" Rachel screamed, her voice breaking. "We have to go." Reluctantly, they fled, their hearts pounding as the forest seemed to close in around them. The song started again, louder and more distorted, like a choir of broken voices. When they finally reached the campsite, it was empty. Their tents were gone. Their gear was gone. Even the fire pit had vanished, leaving no trace they had ever been there. They ran until dawn, the song chasing them through the trees. When they finally emerged from the forest, disheveled and trembling, they found their cars untouched but covered in deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way inside. Tyler was never found. Days turned into weeks, and the group tried to move on, but they couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. At night, each of them heard the lullaby faintly in their homes. It was always just beyond the walls, just out of sight. Rachel was the first to disappear, then Nate. By the time Emma realized the truth, that the mark wasn't just a curse but a promise, it was too late. She woke one night to find her bedroom filled with the scent of pine. The lullaby swelled, and her reflection in the mirror wasn't her own. Somewhere far away, in a circle of pine cones deep in the forest, her friends were waiting, and now she would join them. Story 5. The woods had gone unnervingly quiet that night. Even the crickets, ever the background orchestra of the forest, had muted themselves, as though they, too, were afraid. Jake, Sarah, and Liam had set up camp in a secluded clearing off the main trail of Silver Pine Woods, a spot known only to a few adventurous hikers. They'd laughed around the campfire earlier, sharing ghost stories and toasting marshmallows, blissfully unaware of the true terror waiting for them. By midnight, the fire had burned to embers, and the group retreated to their tents. Jake, ever the cautious one, zipped up his tent tightly and double-checked the stakes. Sarah, an insomniac by nature, read by flashlight in her small one-person tent, while Liam snored almost as soon as his head hit the inflatable pillow. The forest held its breath. Jake was the first to wake, his eyes snapping open to an unsettling sound. Heavy breathing, slow and guttural, just outside his tent. At first he thought it was Liam. The guy had a habit of wandering off at night to relieve himself or scare Sarah with fake animal noises. Jake sat up and whispered, "Liam, is that you?" The breathing stopped. A chill swept over Jake, one that went beyond the crisp night air. He waited for a response, his ears straining against the silence, but none came. For a moment, he considered calling out again, but something told him not to. Instead, he reached for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness inside the tent. As he pointed the light toward the tent's zipper, a new sound emerged, faint, almost imperceptible. It wasn't breathing this time. It was scratching, long, deliberate strokes, as if something or someone was dragging their nails along the nylon fabric. Jake's heart pounded. "Liam, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," he whispered harshly. His voice cracked, betraying his growing fear. The scratching stopped abruptly, and for a brief, hopeful moment, Jake thought it was over. But then he felt it, a cold, clammy hand closing around his ankle, its grip unnaturally strong and unrelenting. Jake screamed, kicking wildly, but the hand didn't let go. Instead, it yanked hard, dragging him toward the edge of the tent. "Oh, Sarah." "Liam," he shouted, his voice piercing the night. Sarah was the first to respond, unzipping her tent and shining her flashlight toward Jake's. "Jake, what's going on?" she called, her voice trembling. Before she could move closer, Jake's tent collapsed inward as though something massive had fallen on it. The material ripped apart, exposing him to the night air. Sarah screamed as she caught a fleeting glimpse of a pale, twisted figure, a thing with elongated limbs and a face that seemed half-formed, like a nightmare caught in the middle of manifesting. Its eyes, if they could even be called that, glowed faintly, reflecting her flashlight beam like a predator's in the dark. The creature released Jake, hissing as it recoiled from the light. Jake scrambled backward, his chest heaving with terror, but the thing didn't pursue. Instead, it turned its grotesque head toward Liam's tent. "Liam, get out of there," Jake shouted, his voice raw with desperation. But Liam didn't wake in time. The creature lunged, its clawed hands slicing through the tent like paper. Sarah's screams echoed through the clearing as she watched the fabric collapse, the thing dragging Liam's limp body into the shadows. By the time Jake and Sarah reached the tent, it was empty, shredded to ribbons. Blood smeared the ground, leading to a set of clawed tracks that disappeared into the dense forest. Liam was gone. The hours until dawn felt like an eternity. Jake and Sarah huddled together by the dim remains of the campfire, weapons improvised from sticks and rocks. But the thing didn't return. The silence was almost worse than the attack. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch sent their hearts racing. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, they finally dared to move. The clearing, bathed in sunlight, looked almost peaceful, except for the torn tents, the bloodstains, and the deep claw marks gouged into the earth. Jake and Sarah followed the tracks into the woods, though every step felt like a mistake. The trail led them deeper than they had ever gone, to a place where the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely penetrated. The air was heavy, and the silence pressed against their ears. They found Liam's shoe first, half buried in the mud, then his backpack, torn and empty. Finally, they came upon a small clearing where the claw marks ended abruptly at the base of a massive oak tree. There was no sign of Liam, no body, just the faint echo of that guttural breathing, as though the thing was still watching them. Jake and Sarah never spoke of that night again, at least not to anyone who would believe them. They left Silver Pine Woods and never returned. The forest reclaimed the campsite, the ripped tents, and the bloodstains, as though it had all been a bad dream. But every so often, hikers would report hearing strange sounds at night, scratching at their tents, heavy breathing just outside. And sometimes, campers would disappear, leaving behind only claw marks and an unbearable silence. Because the thing in the tent, it's still out there, waiting. Story 6. The 6 of them stood at the edge of the meadow, their breaths caught by the sheer beauty of the scene. Sunlight poured through a break in the canopy, casting the field in a warm, golden glow. The tall grasses swayed gently in the breeze, and wildflowers of every color speckled the landscape like a painter's palette. Beyond the meadow stood a dense wall of pine trees, their green needles shimmering in the sunlight. "This is perfect," Molly said, dropping her heavy pack and stretching her arms. "We couldn't have asked for a better spot." Her boyfriend, Jared, nodded in agreement. "Let's set up camp here. We got enough daylight left to explore a little before dinner." The others agreed, and soon tents were erected in a loose circle at the meadow's edge. Logan, the group's self-appointed leader, scouted the area for firewood while the others unpacked sleeping bags and set up a portable stove. By dusk, the group was gathered around a crackling fire, laughter and the smell of roasting marshmallows filling the air. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the chatter. Everyone fell silent. The only sound was the distant rustling of the trees in the wind. "Hear what?" Logan asked, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's probably just an animal," Jared said, shrugging. "We're in the middle of the woods, after all." Emma frowned, but said nothing more. The laughter returned, and the group stayed up late, sharing ghost stories and sipping from a bottle of cheap whiskey Logan had smuggled in. When they finally turned in, the meadow was bathed in silver moonlight, and the forest stood silent and still. Molly was the first to notice the change the next morning. She stepped out of her tent, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and froze. The trees, which had seemed so far away the day before, now loomed much closer. The meadow, which had felt vast and open, seemed smaller, confined. "Jared," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Come look at this." Jared stumbled out, still groggy, and frowned. "Huh, that's weird. Maybe we misjudged how far away they were yesterday." Molly shook her head. "I'm telling you, they've moved." By the time the others emerged, the morning's eerie discovery had been shrugged off as a trick of perception. They spent the day hiking through the surrounding woods, marveling at hidden streams and rocky outcrops. But as they returned to camp that evening, a growing unease settled over them. The trees at the edge of the meadow seemed closer still. "They're not moving," Logan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "It's just our imagination." No one argued, but that night, their laughter around the fire was strained. The forest seemed to press in on them, the shadows between the trees darker and deeper than before. The rustling of leaves, once comforting, now sounded like whispers. The second night brought little sleep. Molly woke with a start, her heart pounding. Something had brushed against her tent. She held her breath, listening. There it was again, a soft, scraping sound, like fingers dragging across the fabric. "Jared," she hissed, shaking him awake. "Something's outside." He groaned but sat up, fumbling for the flashlight. When he unzipped the tent and shone the beam outside, there was nothing there but tall grass and shadows. By morning, the group was on edge. The forest had undeniably crept closer, the trees now just feet away from their tents. Jared suggested moving camp, but Logan insisted they stay. "We're miles from the car," he argued. "It'll be dark before we find another spot." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They spent the day exploring again, but the joy of discovery was gone. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made them jump. When they returned to camp that evening, the trees had moved closer still, their branches hanging over the tents like skeletal fingers. That night, the forest came alive. It started with the whispers, soft and unintelligible, coming from all around them. Then came the creaking of wood, as if the trees were bending and twisting in the dark. The air grew colder, and the fire sputtered as if struggling to stay lit. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Now." Logan nodded, his bravado gone. "Grab what you can. We're getting out of here." But as they hurried to pack, the forest closed in. Branches stretched out like arms, blocking their path. The whispers grew louder, turning into guttural growls. The trees seemed to shift and sway, even though there was no wind. Molly screamed as a root burst from the ground, wrapping around her ankle. Jared and Logan pulled her free, but the root lashed out again, snaking toward them like a living thing. "Run!" Logan shouted, shoving the others forward. They ran blindly into the woods, their flashlights flickering as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. The trees moved around them, blocking their path, forcing them deeper into the forest. Emma tripped, and when Jared turned back to help her, she was gone, her screams swallowed by the night. One by one, the forest claimed them. Logan disappeared into the shadows, his shouts of defiance turning to cries of terror. Jared and Molly held onto each other, but the roots found them, dragging them apart. Molly was the last to go. She clung to a tree trunk, tears streaming down her face as the whispers surrounded her. "Why?" she sobbed. "What do you want?" The forest answered with a single word, a voice like wind through dead leaves. "Everything." Days later, hikers found the meadow empty, the campsite gone without a trace. The forest had reclaimed the land, its trees standing silent and still once more. But if you listen closely, they say you can still hear the whispers calling for more. Story 7. It was the kind of night that made you feel small, the stars pressing down like 1,000 silent watchers. The wind whispered through the dense pines surrounding the campsite, carrying with it the crisp scent of sap and earth. Her friends, Eric, Jason, Mia, and Sarah, sat around the fire, their laughter echoing through the quiet forest. They had spent the day hiking trails that twisted through the heart of the mountains, their boots crunching through golden leaves and brittle twigs. By the time they set up camp, their limbs were sore, but their spirits were high. Jason, always the one for drama, was spinning a ghost story about an old hermit who supposedly haunted these woods. And they say, Jason intoned, his voice low and gravelly, that he carries a lantern to guide lost souls. But if you follow him, you never make it out alive. "Jason, give it a rest," Mia groaned, poking the fire with a stick. "We're here to relax, not scare the crap out of each other." Eric smirked. "Come on, Mia. You're not scared of a little ghost story, are you?" Sarah, sitting closest to the fire, glanced nervously at the shadows dancing on the trees. "I think it's creepy. Can we talk about something else?" But before anyone could respond, a faint light flickered through the trees. It was so distant at first that they all thought it was a trick of the firelight. But as the seconds ticked by, the glow grew stronger, bobbing gently like a firefly in the breeze. "Who's that?" Eric said, standing up and squinting into the darkness. The light came closer, revealing itself to be an old lantern swaying from the hand of a man. He stepped into the clearing, and the group fell silent. The man was in his 60s, maybe older, his face weathered and gaunt, like a piece of wood that had been left in the sun too long. His clothes were patched and stained, and his boots looked like they'd walked 1,000 miles. "Evening," the man said, his voice raspy. Hi," Jason said, exchanging a wary glance with Eric. "Are you lost?" The man shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. "No, but you might be. You shouldn't be here." "What do you mean?" Mia asked, clutching her jacket tighter. The man shuffled closer to the fire, his lantern casting long, twisted shadows. "These woods, they ain't what they seem. When the clock strikes midnight, you stay in your tents. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. You understand me?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Why? What happens at midnight?" The man didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, his face haunted. Some things ain't meant to be seen." "Okay, enough with the cryptic warnings," Jason said, his bravado faltering. "What are you talking about?" The man's grip tightened on the lantern. His hand shook. "You'll hear it. You'll know. But if you step outside, you're done for." And just like that, he turned and walked back into the forest. "Wait," Eric called, but the man didn't stop. Within seconds, the flickering lantern disappeared into the trees, leaving the group in stunned silence. "That was freaky," Mia said, her voice low. Jason laughed nervously. "He's probably just some old lunatic trying to scare us." "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Sarah said. "It's late," Eric said. "Let's just stick it out until morning. The guy's probably full of crap." Reluctantly, they all agreed. But as the hours ticked by, the forest seemed to close in on them. The fire crackled softly, its glow growing weaker as the wood burned down to embers. At exactly 12:01 a.m., a scream ripped through the night. It was a sound none of them could describe, raw and primal, like something being torn apart. It came from above, from the treetops, echoing through the still air. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, clutching Eric's arm. "What the hell was that?" Jason hissed. Another scream followed, even louder, and then the sound of something heavy crashing through the branches. "Stay in the tents," Eric said, his voice trembling. The noise grew closer. Something massive was moving through the underbrush, dragging itself through the dry leaves and snapping twigs. From inside their tents, they could hear it breathing, slow, heavy, and wet, like a bear on the verge of collapse. It circled the campsite, each step sending vibrations through the ground. Mia clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Jason fumbled for the hunting knife he'd brought, but his hands were shaking too badly to grip it. Suddenly, the thing stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. Eric dared to peek through a tiny opening in the tent flap. The fire had burned down to a faint glow, but he could just make out a shape standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in ways no humans could. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dying embers of the fire. and in its twisted claw-like hand, it held the old man's lantern. They didn't sleep that night. The thing didn't leave until the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, its footsteps fading into the distance. When the group finally emerged from their tents, they found the campsite in shambles. The fire pit was cold, their supplies were scattered, and deep gouges were carved into the ground, as if something had dragged its claws through the dirt. Jason found the lantern hanging from a tree branch, its glass cracked and blackened. They packed up and left without a word, their laughter from the previous night a distant memory. No one ever spoke of that night again, but sometimes, when Eric closed his eyes, he could still hear the old man's screams echoing from the treetops. And sometimes, just before sleep, he thought he could see a faint, flickering light at the edge of his vision. Story 8. The forest around Willow Lake was dense, the kind of place where the trees seemed to swallow sound. The group of 5 friends, Emma, Alex, Ben, Rachel, and Chris, had planned this camping trip for months, eager to escape their hectic lives and reconnect with nature. They pitched their tents near a clearing by the lake, lit a crackling fire, and settled in for what they hoped would be a weekend of laughter, esmores, and ghost stories. By the second night, the laughter came. At first, it was faint, a distant giggle carried on the wind. Emma was the first to notice, pausing mid-sentence during one of Alex's jokes. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the fire's gentle crackle. "Hear what?" Ben replied, reaching for another marshmallow. "Laughter," Emma said, turning her head toward the trees. It sounded like kids. The others listened, their conversation trailing off into silence. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the night breeze. Then, faintly, the sound returned, a soft, high-pitched giggle like children playing hide-and-seek. "Creepy," Rachel muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. "There's no one else out here, right?" "Relax," Chris said with a shrug. "Probably just some campers on the other side of the lake." Emma wasn't convinced. The sound didn't feel far away. It felt close, like it was coming from just beyond the ring of trees encircling their camp. That night, the laughter didn't stop. By the third night, the giggling was louder, more frequent. Emma and Rachel were visibly on edge, while Alex and Chris tried to brush it off as a joke. Ben, ever the skeptic, suggested it was some kind of bird or animal. "Kids don't just run around the woods at night," Emma argued, her voice tinged with unease. "Well, unless they're ghosts," Chris said with a grin, earning a glare from Rachel. The group huddled closer to the fire, their conversations growing quieter as the laughter echoed through the trees. It no longer sounded playful. There was something off about it, something wrong. The giggles overlapped, blending together like a chorus of broken voices. That was when they saw the first shadow. It darted between the trees, quick and low, just on the edge of their vision. Emma gasped, pointing toward the darkness. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Chris asked, though his bravado was starting to crack. "A shadow. Someone's out there," Emma insisted. Ben stood, holding a flashlight. "I'll check it out," he said, shining the beam into the woods. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating only swaying branches and underbrush. But the shadows didn't stay in the trees. As the group sat back down, trying to shake off their unease, more figures appeared. They were faint at first, little more than darker patches against the night. But they were moving, slipping between the trees, circling the campsite. No one slept. By now, the laughter was constant, an endless stream of giggles that echoed from every direction. The shadows were closer, no longer hiding behind the trees, but standing just beyond the firelight. Emma tried to count them, her hands trembling. "There's at least a dozen," she whispered. "They're kids," Rachel said, though she didn't sound sure. "Right? They're just kids." Alex shook his head. "No, they're not." The figures were too still, too silent. Their outlines wavered, like smoke caught in a breeze. And their eyes, if they had eyes, were pits of empty darkness. "They've been waiting for us," Ben said, his voice flat. "They've been watching us since we got here." "Waiting for what?" Rachel asked, her voice cracking. "To play," Chris said, his voice barely audible. At midnight, the fire began to dim. No matter how much wood they threw onto it, the flames shrank, the light retreating. The shadows stepped closer, their forms more distinct now. They were small, childlike, but there was something ancient about them, something that made the air feel heavy and cold. A voice broke the silence, a child's voice, high and clear. "Will you play with us?" The question hung in the air, chilling them to their cores. No one answered. The laughter stopped. Then the shadows moved. Chaos erupted. The shadows lunged toward the campers, their forms stretching and twisting unnaturally. Alex grabbed Rachel's hand, pulling her toward the tents, but the shadows were faster. One reached for Emma, its smoky fingers wrapping around her wrist. She screamed, the sound piercing the night as the shadow's touch burned like ice. "Run!" Ben shouted, swinging a burning branch at the nearest figure. The fire seemed to keep them at bay, but only for a moment. The group sprinted through the woods, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The laughter returned, louder and closer, echoing all around them. "They're hurting us," Chris shouted, panic in his voice. He was right. No matter which direction they ran, the shadows were always ahead, guiding them deeper into the forest. When they finally burst into a clearing, they skidded to a halt. In the center of the open space stood a single, massive tree. Its gnarled branches stretched toward the sky like skeletal arms, and at its base was a circle of stones. Inside the circle, dozens of tiny footprints were burned into the earth. The shadows surrounded them, their laughter rising to a deafening crescendo. "We just wanted to play," the child's voice said again, now cold and hollow. The firelight from Ben's branch flickered and died, plunging the group into darkness. The last thing Emma saw before the shadows closed in was the tree's twisted branches, reaching down as if to embrace them. Weeks later, a park ranger found their campsite by Willow Lake. The tents were intact, the fire pit cold, but no sign of the campers remained, except for 5 sets of footprints leading into the woods. And in the clearing, beneath the ancient tree, the ranger found something strange. 5 new sets of tiny footprints burned into the circle of stones. Story 9. The sun was a lazy orange ball sinking behind the ridge when the five of them decided to explore the cave. It wasn't marked on any map, but Gabe had spotted it earlier while they were hiking up the trail. A gaping black maw on the side of the mountain. It looked like the kind of place bats would call home. Or something worse. I don't know, said Jenna, hugging her jacket close. It looks wrong. Wrong. Gabe snorted. It's just a hole in the ground. Don't be such a chicken. You don't get it, Jenna said, her voice low. Places like that don't just happen. They swallow people. You'll see. Her words hung in the cool evening air as the others hesitated. Gabe grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. Suit yourself, he said, grabbing a flashlight from his pack. But I'm going in. Anyone else? Maggie, Gabe's girlfriend, immediately stepped forward. I'm not letting you go alone. The others exchanged glances. Jenna stayed put, arms crossed. Tyler and Scott, always the followers, shrugged and joined the couple. Don't say I didn't warn you, Jenna called after them as their figures melted into the cave's shadow. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that clung to their tongues. Gabe's flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating jagged walls and uneven ground. Water dripped somewhere, the sound amplified in the suffocating silence. Smells like something died in here, Tyler muttered. Probably did, Maggie said, her voice shaky. They moved deeper, their footsteps echoing unnaturally. The walls grew closer, the ceiling lower, until they had to crouch to continue. That's enough, Maggie said finally, grabbing Gabe's arm. Let's go back. But Gabe didn't stop. His light had caught something up ahead, an opening in the rock, wider than the cramped tunnel they'd been following. Just a little further, he said. They emerged into a cavern so vast their lights couldn't reach its farthest corners. The air was colder here, and the smell was stronger, almost rancid. Look, Scott shouted, pointing his flashlight at the ground. At first, they thought it was a pile of rocks, but as they stepped closer, the truth came into sickening focus. Bones! A massive pit filled with them. Some were yellowed and cracked, others fresh and white, their edges sharp as knives. They weren't all human. Animal skulls leered at them with empty eye sockets, ribs twisted together in unnatural configurations. What the hell? Tyler's voice trailed off as he stared at the grisly heap. We need to leave, Maggie whispered, her face pale. Yeah, Scott agreed, already backing away. Now, for once, Gabe didn't argue. The group turned and ran, their flashlights bouncing wildly. The cave seemed darker now, the walls narrower. The smell followed them, stronger and more suffocating. When they burst out into the open air, Jenna was waiting, her face grim. You saw it, didn't you? She asked. No one answered. That night, no one slept well. The campsite felt wrong, though none of them could say why. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the crickets had gone silent, leaving only the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The ground beneath their tents was soft, almost spongy. Tyler joked that it was like sleeping on a waterbed, but no one laughed. Around 2 a.m., Jenna sat bolt upright in her tent. She could hear whispers, faint, almost imperceptible, like wind through dead leaves. Jenna, the voice was thin, distant, but unmistakable. Jenna, come back. She froze, her heart pounding. Who's there? The whisper stopped. By dawn, the air was heavy with the scent of decay. When the group emerged from their tents, they found the ground beneath them wasn't just soft, it was sinking. What the hell is this? Gabe said, poking at the earth with a stick. It gave way like flesh, revealing something dark and wet beneath. Maggie screamed. Look! Around the campsite, faint handprints had appeared in the dirt. Too large to be human, too malformed to belong to any animal. The whispers returned, louder now, rising from the ground itself. More for the pit. The words echoed, overlapping, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. The ground shuddered, rippling like water. We need to go, Jenna shouted, but it was too late. The earth beneath them split open, revealing a churning, fleshy mass that writhed like a living thing. Skeletal hands clawed their way out, dragging themselves toward the group. Tyler was the first to fall, screaming as the ground swallowed him whole. Scott and Maggie ran, but the hands were faster, pulling them down into the pit. Gabe grabbed Jenna's arm, his face pale with terror. Run! They sprinted toward the trail, the whispers growing louder, deafening. More for the pit. When they reached the ridge, Gabe stumbled and fell. Jenna turned to help him, but he shook his head. Go, he yelled. Jenna hesitated, then ran. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station miles away. Breathless and shaking, she tried to explain what had happened, but the rangers didn't believe her. When they returned to the campsite, there was nothing there. No tents, no bones, no signs of struggle. Just an empty clearing, and the faint sound of whispers in the wind. Jenna never went camping again, but sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still hear the whispers. More for the pit. Story 10. The day began like any other adventure for Jason, Clara, and Mike. The three friends had spent countless weekends exploring trails in the countryside, searching for hidden gems far from the bustle of city life. This weekend, they decided on Devil's Hollow, a secluded forest trail about 20 miles outside their small town. The name was ominous, sure, but the pictures online showed breathtaking views of rolling hills, dense woods, and an untouched lake shimmering under the sun. They arrived just after dawn, the sky a soft orange glow. Jason, the self-proclaimed navigator, led the way with his map and compass. Clara, the artist of the group, carried her sketchbook, eager to capture the beauty of the forest. Mike brought his usual, a backpack filled with snacks, a flashlight, and a never-ending stream of sarcastic comments. Are we sure this isn't cursed? Mike quipped as they started down the trail. Because if I get eaten by a bear, I'm haunting you both. Clara rolled her eyes. You're more likely to get eaten by a vending machine. The trio laughed, the sound echoing through the towering pines. The first few miles were picturesque. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Birds chirped overhead, and the air smelled of pine and earth. But as the morning stretched on, an unsettling silence began to creep in. At first, it was subtle. The birdsong stopped, and the rustling of leaves in the wind faded. Even their own footsteps seemed muted, as if the forest were absorbing the sound. Is it just me? Clara said, breaking the silence. Or does this place feel weird? Jason shrugged. It's just quiet, peaceful. But Mike stopped walking. No, she's right. It's too quiet. Like horror movie quiet. They laughed it off, but the unease lingered. About an hour later, Clara noticed something odd. Hey, didn't we pass that tree already? Jason frowned, studying the gnarled oak she pointed to. Its bark was scarred with strange, almost rune-like symbols. Probably just a similar tree, he said. These woods are old. Stuff starts to look the same after a while. But Clara wasn't convinced. She snapped a picture with her phone. Just in case, she muttered. They pressed on, but soon, Mike noticed another tree with the same markings. Then another, and another. Okay, this is officially creepy, Mike said. We're walking in circles. Jason checked his compass, his brow furrowing. That's impossible. We've been heading west this whole time. Your compass is broken, Clara said, her voice tinged with panic. It's not broken. Jason snapped. He was more frustrated than scared, but Clara's fear was infectious. As the afternoon wore on, their pace quickened, but no matter how far they walked, the same symbols appeared on the trees. Jason tried marking his own symbols, carving an X into the bark of a tall pine. Less than an hour later, they passed the same tree again. See? Clara said, her voice trembling. We're trapped. By sunset, the air had grown colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Shadows stretched long and dark across the trail, and an eerie stillness hung heavy in the air. We should set up camp, Jason said finally. We'll figure this out in the morning. No way, Clara said. We need to keep moving. To where? Jason snapped. We're not getting anywhere. Guys, Mike interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you hear that? They froze. Somewhere behind them, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps. Probably another hiker, Jason said, though he didn't sound convinced. At this hour? Clara asked. And why aren't they calling out? The footsteps grew louder, faster. Jason shone his flashlight down the trail, but the beam revealed nothing. When the footsteps stopped, an unnatural silence followed, so heavy it pressed against their ears. Let's keep moving, Jason said, his voice tight. They walked in tense silence, the fading light casting eerie shapes among the trees. Then they saw it, a faint glow ahead. Our campfire, Clara whispered. It can't be, Jason said. We haven't set up camp yet. But as they drew closer, there it was, a flickering fire surrounded by their gear, as if they'd never left. This isn't real, Mike said. It's some kind of trick. Jason stepped closer, his breath visible in the icy air. If it's a trick, who set it up? A sudden gust of wind snuffed out the fire, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in. Clara screamed as something brushed against her arm. Jason shouted, fumbling with his flashlight, but it refused to turn on. And then the laughter started, low and guttural. It echoed through the trees surrounding them. It wasn't human. It was too deep, too fractured, like several voices overlapping. Run, Jason yelled, grabbing Clara's arm. They sprinted blindly through the forest, branches clawing at their faces and arms. The laughter followed, growing louder, more chaotic. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath, they realized they were back at the same tree with the rune-like symbols. The same tree Jason had marked hours ago. "We can't get out," Clara sobbed. Jason dropped to his knees, his face pale and slack. "It doesn't make sense. The trail, the compass." Mike looked up, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. "Guys," he whispered, "look." The runes on the tree glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of their vision, shadows moved. The laughter returned, closer this time, and then the forest began to shift.